Thanks in part to the Freedom of Information Act, enforcement agents Napoleon Solo and Ilya Kuryakin can now discuss their most celebrated affairs. I was doing the lieutenant, as I just mentioned, and I got a note at Camp Pendleton where we were filming when I got back that night to MGM, there would be a script at the main gate there where, believe it or not, the guy's name was Ken Hollywood, who was at the gate. He was the main guard there, Ken Hollywood. And I should pick up the script and meet Mr. Felton at 9 o'clock the following morning in the Thalberg building where he had his office on the MGM lot. Well, Gary and I, Gary Lockwood played the lieutenant, were both bachelors at the time, and we had a couple hours left on the Sunset Strip after midnight, so we went and hit a few places, the Rain Check Room and the Viper Room, it was the Melody Room, then it became the Viper Room, more famous where Phoenix cashed in, River Phoenix. Or the other, was it River? Who was the one that died in front of the bar?
No idea.
Well, the Phoenix is now dead, is the one. Anyway, I didn't read the script. All I noticed was it said Solo on the top of the script. So I knew the drive from my house to MGM was 30 minutes, so I got up at 7:30 and whatever. I guess I left about 8:45. I left at 8:15. And at red lights, I read the script fast as I could because I was normally a fast reader. So I got into Norman's office, 9 o'clock exactly, 12 o'clock in New York. And he said, what do you think? Well, first we talked about the lieutenant for about 30 seconds. And then he said, what do you think? And I said, well, to me it looks like it's, I don't know. And I literally made this out of, I said, James Bond on television. He said, don't say that. He said, you want to do it? And I didn't know what he meant by that. And I said, yeah, definitely, I got a green light from me. And he said, okay. Picked up the phone and said, kept me in New York, whoever the person was. Right away he was on the line and said, Vaughn wants to do it. Okay, put the phone down and said, have your agent give me a call and make a deal. That was how it happened, just like that. Later I found out many other things, but that's how it happened for me, as opposed to the way they do it these days, where you read for 16, 21-year-old MBAs from Harvard before you even get to see anybody connected with the show when you're reading cast in the lead, certainly. That way it was done. Back then it was done by one phone call to New York.
No, I'd come off to as the greatest story ever told, playing Judas Iscariot, and I remember 3 pilots came to me through the agent, or not scripts, but just the ideas. One was Judas Iscariot, which I didn't think would have a very yes, it's a large following. The other was Alexander the Great, and I thought all that armor and rushing around, no way. And then there was this Mr. Solo, with which I had 2 lines and a bunch of jazz records. So it was not a contender. It was it had to be the last. And I said yes. And then went down and shot the pilot.
Well, I knew David because I'd loved him in Freud. I'd seen the picture and I thought he photographed sensation. I thought he really was beautiful on the screen. I mean, it wasn't anything terribly intense, but I mean, it was an optical thing. And then everybody in town wanted the role of Judas Iscariot in The Greatest Story Ever Told. I being one of the ones that wanted it. He got it, so I knew of him beforehand. Freud and Greatest Story Ever Told. Whether you knew of me or not, I don't know.
Well, actually, I didn't.
Well, there you are. On the pilot, I guess, wasn't it?
Probably in the commissary. That's where everybody met at MGM, over a Pat Boone sandwich or whatever it was.
Yes, they had a sandwich named after me, which was just a terrible sandwich. And I immediately sent a memo to Robert Whiteman, who was the head of the studio. I said, either change the name of the sandwich or eliminate it from the menu because it's embarrassing. I don't know why I would get so excited about a sandwich. I don't know, but I was.
We have a problem here because this didn't happen yesterday. It happened, what?
40 years on.
Odd years on.
Yeah.
And I have a general idea of being on the set and specific moments, girls in polka dot bikinis and Leo being very funny. But to remember how I felt on the first day is absolutely impossible. Sorry, I will speak first this time. When I came onto the show, I had 2 or 3 lines in the first episode, and I had a bunch of jazz records under my bed, and I don't think there was much else said about Ilya. So I was very, very minimal. And I think Robert was doing all the work, and I wasn't there that much because I was at home because I wasn't called. And it wasn't until the show started to get going after 2 or 3 or 4 episodes that my part began to get a little larger. When the writers saw the relationships between us, they began to develop. But in the beginning, I had very little to do with anybody.
That's true. and ultimately, through fan reaction and general reaction to the show, David indeed became the co-star of the show. And some people have asked me in the past, then and now, if that bothered me. I said, well, no, I have some very dear friends like David Jenny, no longer alive, and other friends who were in every shot of every show they did, and including doing publicity on the weekend. And I said, I didn't realize it at the time until we got into the last half of the first year, that how much time it actually took out of your life, in addition to publicity, of being on screen all the time. And we were able to share that time for the balance of the 3.5 years the show was on the air, and I thank God for it. Plus the fact that a great deal of the success of the show was dealt by his performance as Ilya, because he made something out of nothing. There was nothing there, as he said in the show. It was a guy named Ilya who's a Russian, we guess, we don't even know that. And whatever happened was developed through his personality and how he was going to play Ilya, making him...
Meanwhile, of course, Robert was wooing all the ladies and getting the girl, which was the one thing.
That was a little ancillary benefit. I wasn't going to bring that up in front of either of our wives. I found out after the fact that he'd gone to college with my stepfather in Iowa, but I always remember both he and Sam Rolfe back off in the shadows watching us rehearse and do the scenes. They weren't on. They may have been on the set a great deal. I wasn't aware of them if they were, but they really didn't involve themselves with us on the set, certainly, in terms of discussing anything. They just came down, nodded their heads, smiled, and they both were very tall gentlemen, 6'2" or 3", and so they kind of stood out in the background. And that's all I knew about Norman, except I worked for him before then, the season before, the first U.N.C.L.E. season, on a series called The Lieutenant. And he told me, I asked him at some point later on, why did you select me for this role? I said, because, I mean, there's nothing in my background necessarily that I'm going to be playing this kind of part. And he said, well, during The Lieutenant, he said, after they would say cut, you'd say something cutting and mean and funny. He said, and that to me was Napoleon Solo, i.e. James Bond, and that's one of the reasons I thought of you. That's the story.
Yes, and these tall gentlemen, Sam and Norman, would come down around 11 o'clock in the morning on a normal day. And it was known as the hanging committee because they just watched dailies. And they would come down and talk to the director about what they'd seen and what they needed to do. But I remember with Norman, he did come rarely to the set. But once I remember we were getting towards the end of the day on Friday. And it was the last day of a show and we were not going to make it. It was 6 pages in 3 hours or 2 hours. And Norman came down and called everybody into the middle of the stage and said that so-and-so a time, 12 minutes past 7, you will wrap and you will do those 6 pages. And he turned around and walked off. And we did. But he was absolutely in charge, but never showed it.
Yeah, very much so. To get high ratings.
Well, I've always heard, and this may be apocryphal, but I have always heard that Norman Felton and Sam Rolfe sat down together and said, you can make an awful lot of money in this world out of merchandising. What kind of a show would that entail? And then they thought, well, you'd need a gun, you'd need a communicator, you could do lunch boxes, lunch pails, or whatever they're called, and so on, and badges, and an association, and if you're fighting crime, I mean, it sort of snowballed, and then they built around that the idea of an organization, and that became, I mean, this could not, maybe it's not true, but it seems awful, the way it all turned out. And we always think that the man from U.N.C.L.E. was Leo G. Carroll. We were the sidekicks.
Yeah. He was the class of the show. Absolutely not, as far as I'm concerned, because politics was never discussed in relation to the show. I discussed a lot of politics a lot of the time with other people, but never in relation to the show at all, no. Well, a lot of people thought that it was a real uncle, and they wrote in asking to join the organization and get badges and everything like we wore. I'd say if the show that we actually wound up doing influenced anybody politically, I'd say we're in deep trouble because of the lunacy of anybody thinking that way. But they did think that way, no question about it. I mentioned one time I was co-hosting a parade in Minneapolis with Hubert Humphrey, who was then vice president, and one of the Secret Service guys with Humphrey came over to me at one point, I think this was in January of the first year, and asked if I could get him some Uncle cards with the rest of the team that were working. I thought he was kidding at first, and he wasn't. Gave me his address, and all the time he's got the thing in his ear and he's talking away. That's when I knew that the show was on its way in some bizarre way, somewhere I wouldn't even know it was going to go, and right after that it did.
Yes, I remember being at the White House and being told by a Secret Service agent that the president will see you now, Mr. McCallum, which is always cool. And you go up those steps past all the bougainvillea and the Marines in their uniforms and everything. And as we're going along, the agent sort of whispered in my ear, he said, "You're the reason I've got this job."
Yeah.
It seems that a lot of young people joined law enforcement as a result of U.N.C.L.E. and ended up on that detail and other detail.
I was never invited to the White House for obvious reasons. I did meet him, LBJ, once, but that's another time for another book and another story. There was a writer who had been a spy and an actor also, whose name escapes me at the moment, who would make casual comments if he was in the show as an actor, but other than that, no one suggested I do anything except show up at 7:30 and get...
Was that Joe Cirola?
No, that was the voice. No, this was a guy who actually had lived in the South Pacific or something and been a spy. He was an actor, and he wrote a couple of shows. And you'll know who he is if you check out the shows, I guess. Start watching 105 shows to find him.
In photography, they made leaps and bounds because Fred Coneycamp decided that he wanted to shoot a certain speed, and we were in black and white and then color, so color was very young in television, and he developed a system where they shot at, I think it was 60-foot candles, and then they would go to the lab, which was right there at MGM, and develop this whole technique of producing color without having to rate it very high and lots of lights. I know that was cutting edge at the time, definitely.
He was under tremendous pressure to shoot 6 days. A much longer show in terms of minutes than they shoot now, but it had to be in 6 days. I don't know, we would lose a day along the way, and then suddenly we'd pick it up, but it was a terrible amount of pressure. We would do 50 setups a day, sometimes, and that's, you do 6 setups, 8 setups, 10 setups a day, today in television. And it was all the pressure was always on Coneycamp. Well, developing methods to get the sunlight at 8 o'clock at night in the wintertime still reflecting on the actors' faces. This is one of the main problems, as we, of course, got shorter and shorter days, and therefore less outdoor time. I can't be specific past that if anybody making a contribution, but I know Fred was able... Oh, I'm sorry. Killy Gabani, our wonderful guy. Killy Gabani, what's it called, the camera?
Arriflex.
Arriflex. In those days, it was just a big lump of a thing that made a lot of noise. And Till made an actual suit that he could get inside of and look out of the suit, which was soundproof, and he would actually get in, when we had a fight scene, he would get into the fight somehow and he'd take pictures. And that was an enormous conversation.
Strapped to his head.
Yeah, he had it to his head, and of course that was unusual, if not unheard of at that time. And now Arriflexes, of course, we don't have that problem, but he made it. That was a great contribution.
He was meticulous, because I remember once he was teaching me how to use the Arriflex, which I did quite frequently. And there was one shot that I did, and when I finished, I went like that and switched it off, and he grabbed me and he said, "You never do that." He said, "You've got to think of people watching dailies, and when you do that, you switch it off and then you drop it, because they must never know this is a handheld shot."
That's right.
His dictum.
One curious thing about Till was that his wife made him a full 3, 4, 5 course Italian dinner every night that he would eat for breakfast in the morning. That's what he had in the morning.
And then he would come and comb lot 3 for all these Italian leaves. There was arugula and stuff out
That
there.
I didn't know.
Then he'd take all these salads back to his wife.
He never read the newspaper, incidentally. And he would go home and have 4 or 5 drinks, go to sleep, and just get up and have his Italian dinner and go to work. He was a very happy man. And smoke a cigar. He was always smiling and always happy.
So Hollywood. Not at all in my case.
Zero. I made a decision based upon your question. I said, since there is no background to this, and I couldn't take James Bond because it wasn't what it was supposed to be. I thought, well, this is the, if you will, romantic lead in an adventure show, and I should try to appear on screen with women at least, if no else, as attractive as I could be, both personality-wise and looks-wise. And that was the extent of my deep penetration into the role of Napoleon Solo, was to look as good and as act as nice and charming as I could.
To start the show off, what we did was we go out and do entrances and exits, driving cars out, driving cars out. So if we did a whole mass of those outside Del Florio's, the tailor shop, various other places. So we would do this, and then they could cut them in through the year. I discovered that if I wore a black suit and a white shirt and a black tie, that was basically going to be my clothing. And in order to make a change, I took my coat off, slipped a turtleneck over the white shirt and tie, and put the jacket back on. And throughout the entire series, that's all I wore. So for the, what was it, 300 what's it years we did it, he's changing clothes every 5 minutes.
Every 5 minutes.
And I never changed my clothes. It was so cool.
And I'm still having that battle with my wife today about changing clothes. I'd like to just be in what I'm wearing right now every day of my life for the rest of my life, but she wants me to change clothes, unfortunately. One thing that I found out about fairly recently was that when I did a pilot for Blake Edwards before U.N.C.L.E, it was only the pilot I had done with M.C.L.E. He did it twice, as a matter of fact. Blake went out and interviewed and talked with girls that had known me, dated me, or I'd worked with to find out whether I had any appeal. This was for his show. It was called The Boston Terrier. And basically they came back with very nice compliments, which I won't go into now. But they all came back with a similar negative comment. Said much of the time, when he's done doing all these other things, he's very remote and detached and almost not there. So I think, well, I can't put that into the part. It doesn't make any sense to me not there, so I scratched that off a list of things I had to do well. But I found it out after the fact anyway.
But you've always been not remote, but detached and in your own world. It's something that I really loved about you, because you're always there totally when the moment comes, and the rest of the time we don't have to worry about you because you're so self-contained and studying, which I also
studying a lot.
Admired,
a lot of reading. Yeah.
And in my case, all I did when it came to anything personal, I suddenly realized that it was a great idea, that people found him more attractive if they made up their own idea of what Ilya Kuryakin was like. So whenever there was a specific, I would quote Shakespeare or throw it out or change it. He did that. And eventually they did an article, I think it was in Life magazine, where Ilya was described as a climate of negatives, which was a wonderful, I felt, boy, I have succeeded. Playing a climate of negatives.
Well,
womanizing in your case.
All right, I'll handle that. Well, I did have, and will always have a terrible fear of water. So they were constantly writing me into water scenes in the show. The writers were, who I got to know I was quite friendly with, Peter Fields and DiNardo. Otherwise, I mean, if Napoleon Solo were a real person, he would be a psychotic sociopath because he exposed himself to death on a weekly basis for 3.5 years. And I have great disdain and fear of violence of any kind, verbal or physical, so I was very unlike Mr. Solo in that sense.
In my past, there was a wonderful actor called Michael Bryant, who came over here in many productions with the National Theatre. And when we were in repertory way back, he said to me one day, he said, always remember when you're on stage that it's you that's there, and over your head is a tram line, and that tram line is your character, and you have a hook, and you hook onto that at the beginning of the play, and you go right through, and that line has to be consistent and always there. But he said, never forget that it's you underneath holding onto that hook. And it really has something I've used in everything I've ever done. So Ilya is me, just as what I'm doing now, the pathologist, Dr. Mallard Ducky, is me. You can't get away from that. You hook on to the character, but it's you that's playing the part. Were you ever challenged? I thought it was the greatest fun and games ever.
It was strictly, the challenge was trying to get more fun out of working every day. That was the greatest challenge of all. No, it wasn't challenging. As a matter of fact, I can confess this now 4 years on. After the first year, I rarely read the scripts at all because it was always the same story. Meet with Mr. Carroll, you go this way, take a fun, meet a girl, you go that way, and we meet with Mr. Carroll at the end. And I would, if I didn't understand something, I'd ask Joyce, the script girl, what does this mean here? And she'd tell me what it meant, and that was it. And that was how I did the last 3 years of the show. I really didn't read them because I was quite busy reading other things.
But it's fun when you do that, because when you see it, you can find out what it's all about.
You're surprised. Oh, is that what I meant when I said that?
I still do that, I have to confess. I think the relationship between us was developed by the writers, not us. I mean, we did, and then they would look at it, and then like a trick, they'd see us do this, write this, and so on. And that's how that happened.
And they knew that we were personally cordial, so they could write bickering into the script, and it wouldn't be something that we had to stretch for or something. We could be bickering or we could be pleasant because we had no personal problems together. All the fan magazines, of course, said the exact opposite, but that was never true. Yeah, I have one, but you go ahead. I think David was out in the hinterlands before I was, and he was like hundreds of girls crowded were waiting to see him when he went to a small town like Baton Rouge or something. That's what.
Oh, I mean, it got to the point where I went to Macy's and I was supposed to appear because I'd done albums at Capitol and I was going to sign album covers. And the police said, with what's down there, you mustn't come down and you mustn't do it.
Yeah.
And the girls then proceeded to tear the entire floor apart. There was thousands of dollars of damage. And they took me out in a police car down in the big elevator. They closed Times Square. And then I shot out of the garage at Macy's into the very center of Times Square, and the thing stalled and it wouldn't work, and the sirens are going and the lights are going, and I'm sitting next to this gentleman policeman, and I very quietly, very Elia-ish said, you know, if you turn the lights off and the siren, you might be able to start this baby. And he did, and off we went. But I mean, that kind of insanity.
Yeah, it really was startling, because neither we were serious young actors, Judas Iscariot, Hamlet, so on. But we were treated as rock stars. It's exactly how it was described at the time, and that's what it was. The first time I knew something was amiss in a positive sense, I went to see Royal Hunt of the Sun here in New York at the amphitheater. And it was, I guess, it was winter time, because I had on a heavy coat. And as I came into the orchestra suite about 5 minutes before curtain, I heard, and a few more, I guess. And as it grew a little bit, I looked around because I wanted to see what was going on. Then people started pointing at me. And then I understood that they were actually, I mean, I've never seen this happen in a New York theater in my life. I've never been there when the president was there or something like that, but I actually haven't. And then the next thing that I knew was David had preceded me into London in the spring of '65, and there was this big hullabaloo about the reaction there. And I think I was doing him in 3 days later, because we eventually met up there. So I didn't really pay much attention to it, because I didn't think I was getting in at 2 o'clock in the morning on a Sunday evening. And sure enough, Heathrow Airport was filled with all these girls with polio, I love you, and so on. Bowler, steamer, whatever they call them, straw hats that they were wearing. 2 o'clock in the morning, it was a school day next day. And so there's a wonderful sequence of pictures, which I have, still pictures. I'm getting off the plane, and those days they didn't have the chute. You came down the stairs, 1965. And I've got my tie done up, and I got a beautiful new suede coat on, my hair is perfect, everything is just fine. And then there are a sequence of pictures, and the last thing you see me getting into an Austin Princess limousine, I have no longer my tie on, my hair is in my eyes, my cheek is cut, and I had gone through this, but they put me in the men's room in Heathrow until they could coordinate the crowd. And that's when I knew I was, if I thought I had any doubts about it before then, that's when I knew we were off and running in some bizarre aspect of a career I never expected to have in terms of fans.
Your life ends in one respect. I used to be a photographer, and I would go out and love to photograph like Cartier-Bresson, the moment décisif and everything, and sneaking around. No longer could you ever go out and take a photograph without, you couldn't go anywhere. I mean, I walked into Central Park, I'd never been to Central Park, it took 4 mounted policemen to get me out of there.
I couldn't buy a shirt in a department store for several years. I had to actually hire a secretary who did all those kind of things for me. Yeah, and I enjoyed buying shirts.
But what's so wonderful is when the show ends, it's like there's a gradual drop-off, and then you're out of there.
The end.
It's all over, you know. And then of course, now we're part of the Smithsonian, so we've become somewhat.
Well, I only I had to deal with aggressive ones because I was living by myself on Mulholland Drive, and I put an electric fence up, tall electric fence, to keep them out. It didn't work. They would somehow get on the property from up above. They caught me showering a number of times on the first floor. Well, actually, it was only one floor, but the shower was deeper than the one floor. And I even went to the point of getting barking dogs and a recording set up. And I never could figure out how to time the thing, and it would start barking when I wasn't there, and the neighbors eventually advised me to stop that silliness with the barking dogs. It was bizarre. I think I attracted the 20-year-olds, and David knows more for the teens, but they were young girls, nevertheless. Would have been in deep trouble if we'd done anything in terms of romance with them, anyway.
My favorite was in Japan, where we suddenly, mistakenly went out a door, and we had none of our security as they have in Japan. And this mob of young girls came dashing down the street towards Catherine and myself, and we thought, it's all over. And they stop about 10 feet from you and all bowed like this. It was quite beautiful.
And when I arrived in Japan, I guess that wasn't the same time, all the girls were behind a very tall piece of plastic about 30 feet away from me, crying. All these girls were crying, which was evidencing to me that that's their way, I presume, of saying they're happy to see me in Japan by crying. And a personal bodyguard also during the time, he's about 5 feet tall. And he had this gigantic gun that was half as big as he. I mean, it really must have been about 18 inches. You could see it through his coat. And he was with me for a number of days I was there. And the last day, he told me that he was the person that dubbed me as Solo in Japan. And his voice, I remember to this day, was one of the most unpleasant voices I've ever heard in my life. That kind of voice. And he was Napoleon Solo in Japan. That's how I found out about it. He was my bodyguard.
I don't hear from anybody really anymore.
I don't really either. I mean, I run into people. I was in Chicago last week and ran into some ladies about 10 years younger than I am, and they grandmothers themselves, and they were telling me that they were fans of the show and they were the age appropriate for that time. That was the middle 60s.
We, on this show, had a gentleman by the name of Chuck Painter, who is probably the most important person next to us when it comes to the success of the show, because he adored Robert, because he'd worked with you on The Lieutenant, and he loved me and my family, and he was very close to us all, and he lived alone, and he was the publicist on the show. And in the beginning, when U.N.C.L.E. began, and I think the networks were putting shows against us and moving things around, and it was not by any means certain that U.N.C.L.E. was going to make it.
Definitely not.
And so he designed a series of publicity events where both of us went off independently to different Nielsen cities, which was the important thing. And in my case, I would arrive in the city, I would find out about what was going on locally, the mayor was having an election, I'd find out the mayor's name. And then I would go into the studio, or the television studio, and hang from the ceiling by a bar, and the camera would zoom up to me up there. No safety lines, just doing these crazy things and saying, whatever you do, vote for Mayor so-and-so on Tuesday, and then they do the U.N.C.L.E. music and stuff. So we'd create these local commercials, and I know that in that year, I did 23,000 miles in flying across the country just to publicize the show at weekends, all designed by Chuck Painter. And I think it had an effect.
Oh, absolutely, no question. We went. The reason I have this information at my beck and call right now is because I've been writing recently about it, but we went from 8.3, which is non-existent on the Nielsen bill, up to 14.3, which is still non-existent, but it came in direct relationship to the amount of publicity the show was getting from these weekend trips to David and Chuck Painter. And then they moved the times from Tuesday night to Monday night, and had a little bump there, but ultimately we weren't really going to be on the air for the 65 season until the rerun started of the first season. And by that time, word of mouth had gotten to parents, from college kids. And word of mouth generated a tremendous response. And all the reruns of the first year, between April and September, they were keeping track of what was going on. We were moving up, so finally we got to the vaunted 20 point, which is 20, keeps you on the air. And then in actually October 18th, 1965, we were the #1 show rate in the country, beating out Bonanza, Bewitched, Dick Van Dyke, all these shows that I had appeared on as guest star. And that's when I knew we were going to be around for a while. But it had to do with Chuck Painter, unquestionably, David McCallum's rising star, and the first year the shows were better. They were adventure and romance with a little bit of humor. And that's unfortunately where it didn't stay. And that's why the show eventually went off the air, because it became a farce. Well, I didn't have a family then, and now that I have a family, I realize how much time it takes to function as a father. I didn't know then because I wasn't married. I went to Norman and I said, I'm working on my doctorate and I want to go leave the set at 3:30 on Thursdays and 2:30 or 3:30 on Wednesday, whatever it was. And at that time we were in the top 13 for the year, and he said, of course, and he set it up that way. Had we not been there, he would have said no. He wouldn't be in his right mind if he said yes, because I was costing them money, there's no question about it. But once you're in a power area with the show, in the Nielsen rating, certainly, you can ask for a lot of things and get them.
Well, I juggled quite well. I got divorced, and Jill went off with Charles Bronson and took care of my children wonderfully. And then before that, I met Catherine, and Catherine and I got married, and we now
Tell us how you met her.
40, we will have been married 40 years.
Tell them
this year.
how you met her.
I did a Man From U.N.C.L.E. publicity.
We did.
Oh, were you there? Oh, yes, you were there too.
That's my point of the story.
We both went to New York to do a publicity thing for
Flatiron.
Glamour magazine, and it was in Jerry Schatzberg's studio, and there were these two lovely ladies, and Catherine, when I went in, was doing her makeup and such like, and Jerry was nailing scenery next door. And I said, you know, the Man From U.N.C.L.E.'s a little bigger than this. Can we do it? I've never seen New York. Let's go outside. There must be places in New York you can show me that we can do the pictures rather than doing them in your studio. And that's when we went out, and right outside down from was the Flatiron building, and I lay on the floor and you jumped over me with Catherine in the polka dress and big hat, and we did that for 2 whole days. We had a wonderful time. The first photograph I remember, I slid down the elevator shaft, the cable of the elevator, onto the roof of the elevator where Jerry was shooting, and we opened one of the doors up high, and Catherine was there in a wedding dress, looking down like this, and that was the first. And I remember Catherine years later wrote to me and said, beware of a woman, the first time you see her is wearing a wedding dress in an elevator shaft.
I have a vague memory, and I think it's correct, that at the conclusion of the second day of shooting, David said something to the effect that, which one do you fancy? Because that's the way you talked to those days. And I didn't get a chance to even open my mouth. He said, I like Catherine. And that was the end of it. Whoever Miss Black was, I guess I wound up with her, I remember.
Yeah, and a few years later we got married, and now it's 40 years.
I know that Jill, his then wife, was on the show 2 or 3 times. I think she was going to be on more than that, but there was some reason why she wasn't, and I can't remember what it was. I guess they didn't want to have... Oh, that was what it was. They didn't want to have Ilya's character connected with the same woman ongoing, because that would reduce his fan appeal to the girls that loved him. So that was the reason Jill didn't work more on the show. That's what I remember, anyway. No, but he was terribly funny, I'll tell you that. He was 71 when he started the show, and he was complaining from day one. And if they ever knew I was this old, they never would have hired me. Of course they knew how old he was. Hitchcock said about Leo G. Carroll, he was the perfect screen actor. And I know exactly what he means, because the man was able to stand there and completely charm the pants off the audience and both of us with no effort whatsoever. He spoke very slowly. He always knew his lines, and when he didn't, he would get them if he didn't know them, which was rare. And he just was a very compelling force and a believable head of this international spy organization, and a slight British twist with Piper or something like that too. But he was also very funny. I'm not going to reveal some of the funny stuff because I'm putting that in my book.
I always remember when they left the camera running once, and Leo in a very loud voice said, "Come in, Honolulu." And it became a catchphrase on the show. And the other thing, when we were coming to the end of one of the years, and I said, "Are you going to go away on a vacation? Where are you going to go, Leo?" He said, no, my wife and I are just going to stay home and watch each other fall apart.
I remember
And
that.
then I said, wouldn't you like to go away somewhere? He said, no, there are too many classics left unread.
I was privy to both those conversations.
I'm sorry, am I spoiling?
No. I've already written that.
Oh.
It's done. Yes, he lived close to the Hollywood Library, and whenever he wasn't on the set, which was only 1 or 2 days a week, he was literally at the library, because friends of mine said, "Did you know Mr. Waverly is hanging out in the Hollywood Library?" And I said, "Well, I do know now, yes."
I'm a British actor that's arrived in Hollywood and is in MGM doing a series that's almost #1 or is #1 with all these people. I mean, the whole thing was just fabulous. I mean, you never really got that analytical about the show. I never really looked at the script and said, "Oh, Peter wrote this," or so. It was a script, and I looked for my lines, and I had fun doing it. And I remember I had a little time off, and I had to swim in the back lot, and so I had a scuba tank, so I went out and went down, and water and all that, but I found this great big hole. So I went right down the bottom, and it was black, and I came up, and I went over to the special effects guy and said, "What is this great big hole in the water, in the pond?" And he said, "That's where they did all the Johnny Weissmuller dives. They would build whatever he had to dive off right there, surrounded by jungle, of course. And he would dive off, and this was to allow him to have the depth for all the Johnny Weissmuller.
One of the other stages at MGM had the pool that Esther Williams used all the time in all of her movies. It was a huge pool, enormous.
And we were constantly discovering this stuff. We had these dressing rooms, what were they, 12 feet square, 10 feet square, with a bed and a makeup and a wardrobe. And they hooked them all together like railway trains and dragged them around the lot. And one day I came across a little one that was 6 by 6 by 6, and it was rotting. Remember over by the wall? So I talked to Wally, the sound guy, who was a wonderful historian of MGM. He said, "Oh, that's Judy Garland's when she was doing Wizard of Oz."
You said that to you?
And I said, why couldn't they have kept it? And
well, that's another key thing is that when there was a set that had stopped being used for a movie, everybody would rush to find out how long that set was going to stand, and then they'd write an episode, hopefully incorporating it, which reduced the budget considerably, obviously, because they were renting from MGM as opposed to building for MGM, or having MGM build for us.
Which meant we got some pretty big sets.
Yeah. See, it's wonderful when you suddenly realize you're in a hit show and you can say, "I'd like an office, I'd like a phone, I'd like to have a golf cart."
We were you in the same place? There was the Colonel, whatever his name was, Elvis Presley.
Elvis had the first floor of this building, his music company, and Elvis was there much of the time. In the morning he'd arrive with a big long Cadillac with 3 phones on the floor. One was the Colonel, one was his mother in Memphis, and I don't know what the other one was for. So I'd see him on a fairly regular basis. And also the guys from Combat were always covered with dirt and everything. We're always sitting in the hall, and I had to I was always in a tux, I have to step over them, so I had to go up to my second floor of rooms. And I had a bed and a small room for a secretary, another small room for myself. So
we had these great, wonderful places up there. And also in the ground floor was a dance studio with all the markings on the floor from where Fred Astaire had done all these musicals.
Yeah, I didn't know that.
All his writing and such like still there.
And they never charged you for the phone calls, I noticed that. I mean, I would call all over the world.
But I remember also there was a doctor who would come by whenever you needed anything, and there was this briefcase, and it was just full of pills.
Yeah.
He didn't have any equipment in there, just pills.
He gives it one, I gave 2, because he was married.
Oh, I'm allowed to look. Just mustn't touch.
Yes,
but also I went from one marriage to another with a gap in the middle.
That's right. Yeah. Well, it was. You're right. I never would have used that metaphor, but I'll certainly agree with it. It was because each of us had a girl, usually every show. Plus, there were other girls that worked in the Uncle organization who were always very pretty. One was a writer of the show, Lee Chapman, who was a friend of Peter Fields, and she was one of the Uncle girls, very attractive girl. And I kept tab on a number of them over the years. Kept tab, that's a strange expression. All right.
You have a little card file.
I had a card, Rolodex. Only time I was ever hurt on the show, and I did a lot of my own stunts as David did his. I was getting off of a boat somewhere down in Catalina or something, and in order to jump across the space between the water and the boat, I grabbed a hold of a pipe that was there, and the pipe was red hot, and I couldn't get my hands released from it, and it hurt like hell, and I couldn't use that hand for quite a while. But the best time I had was on the Jack Palance show. I think that was the last show we did.
He was just having Jack Palance.
Yeah, he was an immense screen presence, both off the screen and on. And I had just done Hamlet with his wife at the Pasadena Playhouse, and he was sitting in the audience during rehearsals. And you tell me that isn't a creepy thing to have Jack Palance sitting in the office watching you kiss his wife and my mother in the play. That is. That's what I remember most vividly was Jack and his presence.
It is more the people that we had on the show that you remember than the actual situations, because George Sanders, Elsa Lanchester, Joan Crawford,
Vincent Price, Marty Balsam.
I mean, it just goes on and on.
Janet Leigh.
And that produced images that...
And these people were on the first year, incidentally, most of them. And one of the reasons they were on, that I was told, was once the young kids discovered it, they said, Mama or Grandma, Joan Crawford, whatever, you got to get on that show. So people would actually request to be on the show who were well known. That was partially the end of the first year and the beginning of the second year. One time I was sleeping, the set was closed, the stage was done, and I didn't have to go anywhere, and I had a little tiny, about 6 by 6 or 8 by 8 portable room at that time. And for some reason they weren't moving it to the next set, so I was sleeping late in the afternoon on a leather couch in the bar. And I had a sign up, which I eventually took down because everybody didn't like it. It said, if you knock, you better have a goddamn good reason, which wasn't too friendly, I guess, so I did take it down. So there was no sign there. And There's a knock on the door, and I kind of woke up. I said, "Who is it?" The voice said, "Katharine Hepburn." I said, "Come on in, Katie." Well, it was Katharine Hepburn with 3 kids who wanted an autograph. And that was the most startling thing that occurred during Uncle in terms of a famous person visiting the set.
Oh, there's a wonderful photograph of me with Nelson Rockefeller
Yeah.
and his wife and all these children. And I was doing a tennis thing on back lots. I'm in white, and so are they. We're all in white clothes. It's a funny photograph. And of course, I have Gloria Swanson. That's another photograph.
The only credentialed Republican I knew was our Fred Koenikamp, so I was able to introduce them to each other, and they both were happy meeting each other. Mm-hmm. Well, I don't think. I mean, I might have said that. I'm not sure, but I grew to know Peter Fields very well. I had dinner with him almost every night, and he was constantly working with Dean Hardwell. So out of those dinners, I think he used to add some things I might have said in the script. But other than that, I never tried to push anything that I had in mind, because I thought the scripts were very good, particularly the first season, went exactly on the money, and the reaction was obviously good, so I didn't think why.
But towards the end, we used to work on the tag, as they called it, the end of the show. They had a little wrap-up scene, and they'd do something goofy in it, or something, and those are the only things I felt that needed to be improved. And we did. Yeah, they were wonderful about it. I remember once somebody said your script in an interview, and I said, "Oh, we make it up as we go along."
I'm sure the writers love that.
And Peter got very upset. Yeah. I said, "I was joking."
Yeah.
We didn't ad-lib very much. We would create business to find the humor in the scenes, like firing 5 shots at a handle and it's already open and stuff like that. I mean, it's whatever. I mean, you looked for places to make things amusing, but the scripts basically were written wonderfully, and we just stuck to them.
Well, we did ad-libbing after the director said cut sometimes, which usually got a laugh and then kept the atmosphere of the set jocular and everybody just liked. We had a lot of fun and a lot of laughs, and didn't take it all very seriously in terms of artistic input, but it was fun to go to work every day. Really fun. Dean and Peter Fields were considered the Uncle writers the first couple of years. Peter had never written a script in his life. He was a lawyer for William Morris, and somehow he wound up meeting Sam Rolfe, and Rolfe, I guess he said, "I'd like to write one of these," and Rolfe gave him a couple of ideas, and Peter selected one of the ideas and went in the next room and knocked out the first act in 2 hours. He didn't know. He thought you're supposed to write the script a day or something. He didn't know. And Sam came back. He said, "Okay, I'm done." He said, "What do you mean?" And he handed him the first act of the show, whatever that was. And he wrote the whole script that day because he didn't know any better. But it was a very clever script. I remember it very well. I felt that way. Yes.
I've never been bad at height. I don't know where that came from.
Well, I had to jump in the Pacific Ocean one time, way out, because we couldn't see land, and John Hackett at that time was an old friend of mine from college. He was the script supervisor the 3rd year, and he was very concerned because he knew I not only was afraid of water, I couldn't swim. And I just jumped in. I figured, well, somebody will pull me back aboard, and that's all.
If you can't swim, that does give you a good reason to be afraid of water.
Yeah. Well, I can swim from the middle of the pool to the edge.
Yes, but the trouble is the Pacific Ocean is not quite like that.
It's a large pool. Yeah. I couldn't handle that, the edges there at all. Well, Griffith Park Observatory, because this was 10 years after Rebel Without a Cause, and we shot there more than once. One was in a show where I played, it was called The Double Affair, and I played myself fighting with myself.
And I used to watch the American films, as they were called, when growing up in London and going to the local Odeon. And I would say, "Hey, wait, didn't they do Mrs. Miniver there? And didn't they? Oh, that's from so-and-so and so-and-so." You kept on seeing these things from old movies.
See, they had, no longer there, they had Lot 2, which was every capital over the whole world in exteriors. And then they had Lot 3, which was the Showboat from Showboat, Jungle and it was all there. We didn't have to drive more than 15 minutes.
Ice stations, zebras, submarines.
Everything was there 15 minutes from my dressing room.
What is very interesting to go in, I'm sure Robert can do a better analysis than I, but the whole thing of the Vietnam War and the really angst, the terrible times that this country was going through, the people who were against the war and not necessarily for it, but at least supporting the military, supporting the government. It's very similar to what's happening today, but back then it was a very hard time for this country, and this show came out. And it had a Russian and it had an American working together in unit together in order to save the world from all these terrible things. And I think there was a certain degree of vicarious, I don't know what's the word, I mean, it allowed people to laugh at a situation which was very serious in the papers every day.
I think that's a key thing, because the Cold War was acted out on television in our show, Thrush and Uncle opposing each other, and it gave them, if they bothered to think about it at all, it gave them a chance to see good and evil forces on television without it actually happening in real life. Well, it was happening in Vietnam, but that's another story.
I think we took sides in that sense, but at the same time, it was a fact that a Russian working with an American, I mean, could happen.
There were people who thought that we'd suddenly find out he had been an undercover agent all along, either for the United States, I'm not sure, the other way around or something, but that didn't happen on the screen, nor would I want it to happen, because it would then become much too serious.
They did write in a script that I went to the University of Georgia, and I remember adding, in the Ukraine.
In the Ukraine, yeah.
No, well, I'm doing a show today on the NCIS. We have a series of directors exactly the same as we did back in the days of U.N.C.L.E. And the rotation of good directors works well because they have time to prepare. And the same happened back then.
No, they just, if they liked the director's work, and if he was available on X date, they'd rehire him. And then if he did a good job again, they'd rehire him. So yeah. I think they had 3 or 4 guys like Dick Donner and
Alvin Ganser
and
Joe Sargent.
Joe Sargent, and I can't think of the other.
Gert Oswald.
Yeah, they just they turned out good shows. And
then the guy who used to kill people, whose name I can't remember.
Kill people, I don't know that.
Oh.
Well, having directed 1 hour American television, which I have, it's a traffic cop job as far as I'm concerned. You have so many pages to do, get it done, and move on to the next day at work, and that's it. That's all you can do. Maybe you get 1 rehearsal for the camera and lighting, and that's about it. Now, other shows may have worked differently, but that was my experience while directing.
And I think setting it up is where a director works best. Working with the design department, working with clothes, working with the casting thing. You put your imprint on that. And if you're going to shoot in a Western set, an OK Corral situation or a gunfight or whatever, they'd go off to Lot 3 where there were all these Western towns, and they'd pick one and they'd decide where they were going to do it. And in that way they'd put their imprint on.
Some directors worked like Hitchcock, would come in with scenes written down, cameras and everything like that, and most of them didn't do that. They were, when they finished casting the show and picked out the sets and everything, they were ready to move fast on the first day and keep moving until the 6th day was over. Ones we just mentioned, I like Al Ganser, Joe Sargent, Dick Donner.
They were fun to work with.
Yeah.
And Alvin Ganser he used to have his golf clubs. It would be on location, we'd be whacking balls into the next field. I mean, we just had a good time.
Yeah, if you weren't fun to work with, you probably didn't come back another time around. If you were any kind of a...
Because you're under pressure.
Yeah.
And you've got to relieve that pressure in some way, every day. Oh, it was the one we never did. Freddie Waugh, who was a high wire guy, who did a lot of stunts with me, and he would run along the top of the roof and jump off this incredible jump, land on this roof, jump down, dive behind a tree, and as he went, I'd come spinning out from the other side of the tree. And it would look as if I'd done the whole thing. So we were always designing these very complicated, choreographed stunts. And we were working on one. He knew about a script, and he had this camera that he'd built into the thing.
Yeah, I remember that.
And we were going to take a marine slide from the top of the studio on Lot 1 and rig it right the way across into Lot 3, into Lot 2. And I was going to come running across the roof and grab this loop my wrist and kick off. And he would be in front of me with his, and the two of us were going to slide right across from Lot 1 to Lot 2. And they canceled the show. But that was the one I wanted to do.
The only problem I remember is I had to avoid laughing, because in one show I had to dance with a guy in a gorilla suit. And
I remember him.
Yeah,
and he made a specialty of gorillas.
Yes, he'd been a gorilla actor in the past, and I just thought, where has this show come from to where it has gone now that I'm dancing with a guy who's a famous gorilla actor in a gorilla suit? And I didn't pursue it any further, but that was what stands out in my mind. The gorilla show, the gorilla affair. I never did. No. It's hard.
No, there are people who are very good at directing, and actors should act, and directors should direct. And I don't know if it's an ego trip when people cross it, but I don't know the reason for it.
Well, I have an experience because I actually did it myself. I did a show in London for 3 years called The Protectors, and I directed some of the segments, and the ones that I directed were dreadful because all I was doing was looking at everybody else acting and whether they were in the right place. And in other words, I was not paying any attention to what I should be paying attention to, which was my character. I was paying attention to the show as a director, and it really showed on the screen for me. So I ceased and desisted from that point on of ever directing myself in anything.
I remember I directed for BBC Time Life in Africa. I did a documentary. And the amount of work you have to do in order to direct, there's no way you can act at the same time. I have no way I could anyway. Clint Eastwood does it very well.
Well, he directs very slowly, you see, and he talks very slowly. Everybody else talks slowly. There's no pressure, but he...
Yeah.
He did everything, I guess. I didn't actually direct. He was post-production, but I think he had his finger in the pilot, and I think he had his finger in the last show, and I think he was involved all the way through the show with many things.
I mean, a lot of people don't realize you can have a script, you can have actors, you can have camera, lights, sets, you shoot the thing, and then this film. That's, pretty much 50 to 60% of it. There's 40% left. And what the post-production people do, particularly today in television, is just amazing. I mean, the sound that they do, the changes, the dubbing, the music, the effects, the negative, the balancing the car. I mean, it's huge. And I always remember George was completely responsible for all of that.
He was a Republican and he supported the war in Vietnam, which I did not. And we've always got along very well. And a couple of times in the last year, he would say, "What do you say when you go out?" I said, "Well, I'll give you the speech. You can look at." So we had a habit of, I don't know how many times we had it, maybe 2 or 3. He would critique the speech and move it in along the sideline. "This is incorrect. That date is wrong. What are you talking about here?" And that's the kind of relationship we have. We get completely apart in terms of the war, but we get along very well, personally.
And we did sound looping for those technically interested. Nowadays, you have lines that go across and headphones and the whole, and you've got to learn the technique on how to change sometimes dialogue or correct dialogue, or when there's been noise and they have to repeat the line. In those days, we did sound loops. You'd go in and all you'd hear was, "What are you doing today?" And you'd say, "What are you doing today?" Next loop. And we used to rattle through those.
We used to rattle through them, and finally they got so far behind in their looping that they had a little trailer once again, and you went into the little trailer with Freddie Fula, who was the sound man, and we do exactly what David was saying. There was nothing in there except the sound, and then they moved the trailer. If we went to another stage, they moved the trailer, and if we had 3 minutes free, we'd run out and do a line from show 24, and it was always going, fast.
Never. Don't use the word. There is no grind when an actor is working and being paid.
We also, as David pointed out earlier, first alone and then with me, did publicity on the weekends all around the United States. Fly out on Friday night to New York, go to these various places, come back, take the last flight from New York back to LA, and be on the set 7 o'clock. So it wasn't just the show, it was the publicity the first 18 months or so. And I was also going to school at the time, and also opposing the war, so I was a busy boy.
In a lifetime, I mean, I've been fortunate enough to have 2 shows in the top 10 in one lifetime, which I think is kind of the absolute creme de la creme. The opportunity in a lifetime to do a series on network television in this country as an actor is so rare and so special that you have to realize what an opportunity you're being given. And if you have to work 24 hours a day in order to do it, then that's what you must do as an actor. I don't think you should ever think of it as grind or something onerous. You're being paid to do what you were born to do. And it may take a lot of time, and there may be problems, and you may go nuts sometimes and work with terrible actors sometimes, or rarely. But, you know, it's only, 3 or 4 years of your life. And in that time, you create something which is so extraordinarily special. I don't think you can ever talk about a job like that in a negative way.
Yeah, that's why I've never bum-racked the show, because there's no reason to. It was a wonderful experience. And it put both of us, after the show was over, in a stronger position for doing other kind of work, movies, television, and so on. And you kind of go from, I use the phrase, I don't know whether it's pompous or not, but I went from being a working actor, which I was, as David was, to being a negotiating actor. I could actually say, well, couldn't I get 3 days of per diems for this, or couldn't I get 3 first-class tickets, or couldn't I, the couldn'ts that you couldn't say before because you had no position. You then had a position, and you had you negotiated, or your agent did, in effect. And that was the big difference for me.
Wasn't it a thing called TVQ?
Yeah.
There was a thing, it's a TVQ, which I discovered, and it's a list that you get onto, and you're allowed to do certain things in television, and when they cast television, it's only television, when they cast it, they would look up to see what your TVQ was, or where you stood in the eyes of the public.
And there were two classifications in TV. There may have been more than two, but they're knowledgeability, did they know who you are, and likability. Because a lot of people rank very high in knowledgeability who were very disliked by the public just because they had a role that was unpleasant on the screen that made them unattractive people. So you had to score high in both areas to get cast in some situations.
I think there's an awful lot of hype involved in all this because we never did something dangerous. Both of us are wise enough not to do dangerous things. Secondly, the insurance companies who insured the show would not allow us to do, and the assistant directors would not allow us to do them. What we did was to do, what I did, and I'm sure Robert did too, was to do very carefully laid out where you were physically doing something which called for a little agility and coordination, and hopefully you didn't hit anybody when you shouldn't. And they took a little bit of physical effort, but no more than a good workout in a gym.
Yeah.
And then the publicity department took over, and we were doing these insanely dangerous things.
When there'd be a fight scene, my stunt double was named Dick Geary, when there'd be a fight scene, early on I made it clear to Dick that I didn't want to see the fight scene until he was done choreographing the fight scene, because I didn't want to learn anything physically. I didn't have to learn physically. That's how we set it up. He would go in, and when the last time before we were going to shoot the tape with me in it, then he would do it for me, and I would just remember it as you'd remember choreography in a dance. I've been reasonably well coordinated all my life, sports-wise, so it was not a big deal. And I knew how to throw a punch.
When Sonny and Cher came on and did the one all about the tailor shop,
yeah.
And Sonny insisted upon doing the fight and wouldn't let the double do it. And he just turned the wrong way, and the stuntman laid him out cold.
Well, before I did U.N.C.L.E., I did a picture in Munich with Cliff Robertson. He insisted on doing the fight scene with me, and it wound up the other way around. I hit him, he moved in the wrong direction, and I knocked him down. And it hurt my hand like hell, I'll tell you that. And that was the last time I had a couple times after that, they said, the actor would like to do and I said, no, I want to do it with the stuntman, or somebody else do my part, because I don't want to work with an actor anymore, because it might be me on the receiving end of the wrong punch.
But high falls are fun, because you're landing on the biggest mattress you've ever seen in all your life. I only remember one episode where I did something where I almost did myself a terrible injury. And I was doing a takeoff of Slim Pickens, is that his name, coming down on the atom bomb at the end of
that was
A Strange Love.
First show of the first season.
And we had a great big rocket, and I straddled it, and the wires were here and there, and then they lifted me up, and I was like holding on like that, and they tipped it slightly. I don't know what the scene was, but it began to move. And it began where the point where I was actually going to go over, but my thumb was underneath the wire. I remember that so clearly, and I knew if I stay on this thing, I'm going to be without a thumb.
Yeah.
And I just bailed and hit the floor. You know that?
Well, I had the one that my wife was still talking about. We had in the U.N.C.L.E. headquarters, there was a long walkway which had a cover on it. I guess it was the first or second show. And David I guess I must have been on David's, I don't know how it worked out, but somehow the noise of the gun going off and the explosion wrecked my ear for a while. I had tinnitus.
It was 4 or 5 corridors all coming together, and it reflected right into you.
Yeah, and other than that, I never had any.
So that's when we went from shooting bullets to shooting whatever they were, that paralyzed.
They made a little sound instead of an explosive sound.
We were in a cellar once, and Robert was hanging from the ceiling, and I had a Bowie knife. And I ran into the room, and I threw the Bowie knife, and it cut the rope, and Robert fell down. And when we came to do it, there's a wire. I drop the one I'm holding down my back, and they fire one on a catapult up the wire. It hits the wall beside you, they release Robert, and he falls. And I dropped it, and it went like this. I didn't do anything, and they fired the catapult, and the knife, when it was about halfway, the wire broke, and it was heading for about half a second. I thought, series over, and it buried itself in the wood right by Robert's that ear, and quivered. And he got down and got his book out and started to study. And I was thinking, that was a very close call.
I don't remember that, but I certainly agree with you. It sounds like a close
Well, you
call.
probably didn't know it broke. You probably just
but
realized it was all part of the act. That's still my favorite U.N.C.L.E. show because...
Wasn't that Jack Palance? The gangsters, all the real time.
Well, Edward Chianelli, the whole...
Yeah, that was a wonderful. All the old guys.
All the guys from Warner Brothers, and I'd seen them all on television, in the movies, and they were growing up.
It was a mafia show without mentioning mafia.
On a waterfront, and I remember. And who was the one that Peter? Elijah Cook.
Elijah Cook Jr.
Yeah. I mean, this.
And there was Alan someone.
Magical. I mean, if you're looking for a reason to buy what we're talking about here, just to go through and look at the faces of who were in them and look at their careers and what they did, it's extraordinary.
Well, the first season for me, even though it was in black and white, was closer to what I thought the show should have been the entire 4 years. But what main thing is we had different producers. We were constantly trying to put their imprimatur on the show, because even though a successful show, they wanted to change a little bit so that they could say, this is what he did for the show. Well, it was the other way around. It was always a negative thing. It made the show less attractive.
So it was Famrol,
Boris Ingster,
David
Victor, and then the guy the last year who only did the 12 shows, I don't know what his name was. Anthony Spinner. Right, that was the last.
By that time it was...
Well, by that time I was in trouble, and we were spinning. Our heads were already out of MGM going someplace else. Absolutely.
Yeah, and I said I wouldn't appear in it. Did you appear?
I did.
Didn't they tell you we were both going to appear and you didn't?
Probably. They often got me to do things and then you didn't show up. It wasn't your fault.
Sorry about that.
Yeah, well, strangely enough, Stephanie, well, the girl from U.N.C.L.E. really wasn't the girl from U.N.C.L.E. Marianne Mobley was Miss America, played the same character in the show on Man From U.N.C.L.E. called The Moonglow Affair. And when they decided to make The Girl From U.N.C.L.E., which was against Norman Felton's wishes, as I understand, they decided that Marianne was too sweet and gentle. She couldn't be tough and strong like the guys were. So that's when they hired Stephanie, who later married the lieutenant, Gary Lockwood, to keep you up to date on stuff like that. A guy who produced it and wrote it had Michael Sloan had been a fan of the show when he was a teenager, and as I remember, he said he submitted a script for the 4th season, and the show was canceled, so he didn't get it. But he dreamed of doing it again, and he eventually saw his dream come true. And as I recall, it was on CBS, and it got pretty good ratings, but we weren't asked to do another return show.
No, but the wonderful thing about that was we returned it, and now that's it. It was the end of it. They put it, and since then, there are all these people, Quentin Tarantino among them, who have optioned U.N.C.L.E. But they've got to talk to us first, because it is absolutely impossible to make a movie of the return of the Man From U.N.C.L.E. It just will never work. There's no way you can do it, which is also great.
As Leo G. Carroll, yes.
Oh. How come you get to be Leo?
Well, I spoke up first, that's why.
It is impossible to do it. You can't make it contemporary, because it makes no sense. We have no Cold War. I mean, everything to do with U.N.C.L.E. doesn't exist anymore. You can't do it as a historical piece. As Jane Fonda's husband said, I've got 105 of them, why should I bother to do it again? I mean, there are many, many reasons. There's no way you can frame it. And then they talked about having uncle agents who were the son of Napoleon Solo and the son of Ilya getting together. But then, where? I mean, Salvation Army? I mean, it just doesn't make any sense.
I would definitely select George Clooney, because I think he's got the sense of humor, and he's got a good look for him. He's got a kind of a old-fashioned... That's embarrassing.
I don't know, it's John Clooney, George Clooney.
George Clooney? Hello?
This is it. We don't see each other that much, unfortunately.
We ran into each other accidentally in Valencia a couple months ago. And on Broadway. And he lives in New York, I live in Connecticut. And we talk on the phone, and we didn't see each other much when we were doing the show, other than on the stage, because he was married.
No, you took me to a health food restaurant, and I was terribly ill the next day.
You were in.
Now, is that what it was?
Yeah. Well, there've been long lapses where I was in England for 4 years, things like that, but we've kept in touch. We know how each other's children.
There was a wonderful book years ago called Future Shock. It used to describe, yes, and how relationships in certain places you will, in the future, and it described our business as being from the future, but you plug in, all these people come together and plug in and have very close relationships, and when the work is over, you unplug and you all go your separate ways. And that's what happens in this business. And sometimes you get married to some of them. The other things happen. But at the same time, basically, it's an incredibly close relationship that comes together and then ends. The difference here is that the interest in the show has kept the whole thing bubbling and boiling.
And it's not, you can be on a location for a movie for 3 months and see somebody every day, as I did Ben Gazzara and George Segal on a movie in Prague. And I would swear that we would see each other for the rest of our lives. Now we see each other once every 3 years because we spent every day, every lunch, every dinner together for 3 months, plus witnessing and experiencing the invasion of Czechoslovakia by the Soviet Union at that time. So it was a very important international event, and we thought we'd be talking about that for years and years and years to come, and that's not the case. I saw Ben years ago once, and George, at Jim Coburn's funeral. Well, how to do it quick is the main lesson I learned, that you don't, if you're doing a television series, you better arrive ready to go, one rehearsal, and the next time you see it, it's on the screen 6 weeks later in your television, at home. It's just learning to work at that speed, as opposed to weeks and weeks and weeks on a movie, or weeks and weeks and weeks rehearsing a play before you do the play.
But you were always absolutely dead word perfect from the word go. You never looked at a script.
Yeah, that's why I had no trouble doing it. I had some kind of half-ass photographic memory that I remember positions of words on a page, even after I looked at the page for a half hour later. I just remember words. It's getting less and less, getting more and more dim, but it was the case, and still pretty much the case. My head was in Southeast Asia. I had no thoughts at all about doing anything other than being involved with the anti-war movement. It never occurred to me to even think about working as an actor at that point.
My life changed completely because I thought if I stay away from television for a little while, it'll all go away. And here we are 44 years later, still talking about it. So I was wrong. So Catherine and I decided that we would move back to New York. And having gone through the divorce, we tried to do as much as we could for the children. But then we decided and we left, and I moved back to New York. And my life really from then on was more theater in New York and doing plays on tour in the summertime, and less movies and less television. And in fact, the only time, most of the television I did was in Europe, and only when NCIS came along did I really think, well, yes, I'm going back to Los Angeles after all these years. And it's interesting to know that I am the same age when I started NCIS as Leo was when he started U.N.C.L.E, because it's an interesting parallel to me.
And of course, the big change in my life was having been I thought I was going to be a perennial bachelor, well, I was, but I met my wife in 1970, about 18 months after the show went off the air, and then we were married. We lived together for 4 years in London when I was doing the series there, and I married her in 74. So my life did a complete 180. Somebody's on television and said, well, he did a complete 360, meaning 180. Anyway, I did a 180, and I have had children and a home and a wife and holidays and all that stuff for the second half of my life. If I'd lived I think I may have said this to you before, if I'd lived the second half of my life the way I did the first half of my life, I wouldn't be talking to you today. I wouldn't have been in good health, let's put it that way. I was given all of them on tape.
Yeah, he did an introduction to something, and they gave them.
They gave me all the tapes. It was in Hartford about 15 years ago, and they said, would you like to come in and sit in front of a Christmas tree and introduce the show? And I said, what do I get for this? And he said, we have no budget. I said, well, I'm not going to do it. And I put down the phone. My wife said, get all the shows. I picked him up and said, will you give me all the shows? I said, yeah, so I've got 105 shows on tape at home. Now I'm going to have 105 shows on CVDs, whatever they're called. I tend to think sometimes when people come up to me in public and say something about the show, they just want to have an excuse to say hello to me, not the show. And I don't believe that they loved it as much as they tell me they loved it at the time they're talking to me. I have a feeling there's a modicum of lying there somewhere.
And also what was going on in their lives at the time they were watching it has a very strong bearing as to why they remember it.
And what age they were, what radio age they were.
Yeah. Music?
Well, my radio is, wherever I am in the house where I have a radio, it's set to 96.3, which is New York classical music.
Yeah.
And that's all I ever listened to. It's
And
calming.
I have over the last year been studying The Ring of Wagner and Das Rheingold and all of that, and I principally listen to classical music, but if Catherine and I are together and we want to listen to music, it's mostly 60s and Ella Fitzgerald and that whole genre.
I just bought, not too long ago, everything Sinatra ever recorded, I think. I didn't buy it, it was a gift from me, and I'm starting to go through his, how do you pronounce that word, however you spell, you know what I mean? His stuff.
Yeah.
So that's what I'm currently doing, his stuff I should have been listening to.
Well, there is so much music to listen to, it's just limitless.
Yeah.
And I got Sirius Radio in the car, I mean, that's all you need.
Or you can get Howard Stern.
I actually have avoided Less is Hard. In when we were doing the return, actually, with Michael Sloan, I went into a junk shop on Melrose and bought the Barbie doll of myself as Ilya Kuryakin. I think I paid $104 for it, and I gave it to Catherine and said, "Here you are, you're the only person with a Ken doll of your husband."
It's worth a lot more now, probably.
Probably.
Oh, it's a Ken doll. You said it was a Barbie doll.
Well, no, sorry.
That was the unique part about it.
It's an Ilya doll, shall
okay.
we say, but it's whatever the nomenclature is.
I will speak, all right? I enjoy it immensely. I never didn't enjoy it, and it was a major turning point in my life, and they can talk to me about it till I'm being settled into my grave. I'll still respond in kind, because it was a wonderful time of my life. I really loved it, as did everyone else that worked on the show, and it was the best experience they ever had in their professional life, and I agree with them. It was my best experience.
I would agree with that. Yeah. And sometimes, I mean, it's always nice to talk about the old days, but in a way, at times it can be a little like taking out the old family album. There are sort of embarrassing moments there, but no, it was a wonderful time in both our lives. Life's great.
Best 4 years of my life.
Interesting.
Well, considering I didn't have to do anything except change clothes and show up, it was one of my very favorite.
No, it's part of a whole section of one's life, of my life, and it was a wonderful, wonderful time, going from Britain to America to Hollywood to everything that happened. It's got even better since, and I ain't finished.
I was writing something the other day, because I'm writing an autobiography, and I was concluding the section on the Man From U.N.C.L.E, and I think the last line was, "But the most enjoyable part of the show is meeting two exquisite gentlemen and artists, David McCallum and Leo G. Carroll," who was the class of the show, Leo G. Carroll. And that's really what I feel about it.
That's very nice of you. I feel the same way as about you, but I'm not writing an autobiography.
We can contribute to mine with the Ilya chapter.